Hi, and welcome to the Azure News Recap for March 2024. This is a big list edition. There's a lot of announcement that we need to process. So here goes. We'll go into retiring features, do general availability, and then we'll have a look at preview features last. But first up, retiring features. There's a couple of classic services that are going into retirement. And first of all, we have the classic deployment model for cloud services. Those will go into retirement August 31st, 2024. So that's this year. And please be advised that starting September 1st, all your existing cloud services that are still using the classic deployment model will be stopped and deallocated, which might lead to permanent data loss. So please make sure to migrate over to the new extended support version before August 31st. Next up are classic administrator roles, which are going into retirement on that same date. And for that, we can transition into using RBAC roles that give the same amount of privileges inside of the subscriptions. Last but not least on this list is Azure Front Door Classic. Azure Front Door Classic will be retired March 31st, 2027, and it allows you to transition over into the Front Door Standard or Premium tier somewhere before that time frame. Next up is Visual Studio App Center, which will be retired March 31st, 2025. You might be able to transition over into Azure Pipelines for building the apps. Please make sure to visit the shared list of all the announcements for this Azure News Recap. That's either on the end of the video or in the description for guidance on the different types of services that you can use if you were using App Center before. Next up, quite a few frameworks, SDKs, and runtimes have been announced to be retired. So, for instance, we have the Azure Maps native SDK for Android and iOS, which will now lead you to transition over to using the Azure Maps Web App SDK in a web view, but also the Service Bus Extensions v4 for Azure Functions will be retired March 31st, 2025. So make sure to transition to v5 to make sure to get continued support. And of course, please don't forget that .NET 7 will be out of support starting May 14 of this year. So you should migrate over to .NET 8. We have a continued list of frameworks, SDKs, and runtimes because a lot of stuff went into retirement. So, for instance, on this page are Node 18, which is out of extended support April 30th, 2025. So please upgrade to Node 20. We have the in-process model for Azure Functions running .NET, which will go into retirement November 10th, 2026. Support for .NET 6 will end November 2024. So both .NET 7 in May and .NET 6 in November will go out of support this year. So please make sure to migrate over to .NET 8. Then moving to general availability. On app service, we now have backup and restore over Azure Virtual Network, which means we can run custom backups for web apps, files, and configuration over a VNet into a firewall protected storage account, which is pretty decent. The app needs to be either integrated into a virtual network or run an app service environment v3. And of course, the storage account either needs to have granted access from the app's virtual network or the v3 app service environment. Next to that, we now have auto scaling for web apps GA, which means that premium v2 and v3 app services will now be able to take advantage of all the possibilities that automatic scaling brings you. For Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL, we have Microsoft Entra ID integration. So we can now use Entra ID authentication on Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL clusters in addition to or instead of the native PostgreSQL authentication. Now, please be advised that this also means that we can use managed identities, which is a very sure way of securing the connection between your applications and your database. Azure IoT Edge now supports Ubuntu Core Snaps, which is actually marketed as being the App Store for Linux. You can download snaps, put them on an Ubuntu environment, and they will run. So we have some Azure Snaps available as well, which allows you to run Azure stuff on Ubuntu Core Snaps, which is a nice addition to the ecosystem. There's a bunch of things that went GA around AKS. I'll mention a few that are on the slides, and there might be even more in the complete list of updates. But for AKS, as far as it goes now, we have the 5,000 node limit, which now means that AKS supports up to 5,000 nodes by default in the standard and premium pricing tier. We have host port auto assign, which means we can automatically assign host ports for pod workloads. We now have Azure CNI overlay dual stack support, which is Linux only, but it allows us to use both IPv4 and IPv6 addresses with AKS. And then the second list, or the continued list, we can do custom kubelet configuration on Windows. We have Kubernetes 1.29, which is now supported. We have support for Windows Gen v2 VMs. We have the cost analysis add-on. Again, there's a huge list of stuff that went GA for AKS in the month of March. Application Gateway v2 now has IPv6 support, which means we can take advantage of the increased address space and the improved routing efficiency that IPv6 gives us. And for container apps, we now have free managed certificates. Now, we've come to expect maybe certificates to be managed for us and handled for us, and maybe even be made available for free for certain specific services when running them on Azure. Now, for container apps, this is true now as well. So we can now have free managed certificates for container apps, which will be automatically renewed for as long as your app meets the requirements. There's also two important things for Azure Functions. So first of all, we have support for Node 20, which means you can now develop it locally using Node 20 and also push it out into an Azure Functions plan either on Linux or on Windows. But maybe more importantly, because I think this is really a big announcement, Azure SQL trigger support has finally gone GA, which means we can now build application logic driven by the data that comes from our Azure SQL database. So for instance, I have a code example here. For instance, we can see we can have a SQL trigger, which in this case listens to a to-do table, and it automatically gives us an read-only list of SQL changes for a class of type to-do item, and it will give those to us as a list of changes. Now, on those changes, we can either ask for the operation, or we could go into the item itself and get all of the value from there. So this is a really, really big announcement. The fact that SQL triggers for Azure Functions are now GA means that we can build our complete Azure Functions environment based off of what happens in a table in, for instance, a SQL database. And I think it's huge. Next up, a list of preview features. So in change analysis, we now have the change actor available, which means that we can see who initiated a change and whatever client they used to do so. If you go into the announcement that we have in the list of announcements for this ANR, you can see that the change actor one, it holds a query that you can use in Azure Resource Graph to talk to the resource changes table, and it actually allows you to get an overview, in this case, of all of the changes of the past 7 days. But of course, you can write that query and adapt it any way you want to. Then on container apps, we have quite a few additions for the Java side of things. So we have now Tomcat support, which means you can use your existing code and configuration to create a cloud-native container app without the hassle. You can just deploy your Java application directly from a WAR file, and you should be good to go. Next to that, we have added some managed Java components, and in this case, specifically, it's Spring Cloud Eureka and Spring Cloud Config Server, and you can use those managed Java components to access the platform features right from your apps. Last but not least, JVM memory fit. All Java apps are now calibrated with JVM memory defaults that have better performance and reliability in a container environment. There used to be some issues with this, but we have solved those with the JVM memory fit. Then we've already seen a lot of GA stuff for AKS, but there's also a lot of preview functionality. So for instance, we now have trusted launch support, which is a seamless way to improve the security of Gen 2 VMs by protecting against advanced and persistent attack techniques. We now have instance level public IP tags, which means that we can put tags on specific node public IPs, which enables utilizing the Azure routing preference feature. But we have more. We have Azure CNI static block IP allocation. We have support for GPU workloads on Windows node pools, and we have Kaito, the add-on. So the Kubernetes AI toolchain operator, which means that we can now run specialized machine learning workloads like LLMs on AKS way more cost efficiently and with less manual configuration. Then going into the Azure SQL Database Watcher. This is advanced monitoring of your Azure SQL resources in minutes. So on the left-hand side here on the slide, we can see what that would actually look like, what that monitoring information and how that actually goes into Watcher and how it flows. And then on the right-hand side, we have a dashboard where each of the hexagons actually represents either a primary, secondary, or geo-replica of a database and its current state. And to dive in a little bit deeper, we can now here see an overview of the performance of our databases with the resource utilization. We can see the requests that come in, at what rate, what time do they take, but also where, for instance, cumulative weights are. So this is actually a big addition to monitoring and watching for performance of databases on Azure SQL. As I said, it's been quite a list. All of the resources are put under aka.ms/ANR-224-03, or you can go to azure.com/updates or scan the QR code, or you can actually find all of the links in the description. Thanks for now. We'll see you next time.